You know Frankenstein as a gothic monster story. But what if I told you the monster was never the real subject of the book at all? What if the true horror that drove Mary Shelley to write this novel wasn't fiction? It was the world she was living in. Every page is a coded confession about the actual terrors of her time. And once you see them, the book reads like a completely different work. Let me start with what's hiding in plain sight: the science. When Frankenstein first appeared in 1818, readers thought Shelley had invented some fantastical pseudoscience about reanimating the dead. But here's the thing: she wasn't inventing, she was documenting. There was a real, legitimate scientific obsession happening right then in laboratories across Europe about electricity and the possibility of bringing dead tissue back to life. It was called Galvanism, and it was taken seriously by the brightest minds of the age. In 1780, an Italian physicist named Luigi Galvani noticed something unsettling. When he applied an electrical charge to a dead frog's leg, the muscle contracted. It moved, not because it was alive again, but because electricity triggered the muscle fibers. It was mechanical, but it looked alive. And this discovery opened up a completely different question in the scientific mind. If electricity can make dead tissue move, what if electricity is what life actually is? What if consciousness itself is just electrical current happening in the brain? By 1815, when Shelley was writing, this wasn't fringe thinking. Respected anatomists and natural philosophers were genuinely investigating whether electricity could reanimate dead matter. There were public demonstrations. In 1803, a scientist named Giovanni Aldini applied electrical current to the corpse of an executed criminal in London in front of hundreds of witnesses. The corpse's face contorted, its legs kicked, its eyes opened. The crowd left convinced they'd seen the threshold of reanimation. They hadn't, but the science looked real enough to terrify people. And Shelley knew it. That's part one. But here's where it gets stranger. To understand why Victor Frankenstein would even think about grave robbing, you need to know what the anatomy trade looked like in the early 1800s. And I'm not talking about Shelley's imagination here. I'm talking about an actual crisis in British medicine. The problem was simple, but brutal. Doctors needed corpses to learn anatomy. There were no other ways. You couldn't understand the human body without dissecting it. But Britain had almost no legal supply of cadavers. Executions happened, sure, but not frequently enough or in the right places. The body of an executed criminal was occasionally dissected as part of the punishment, but that was rare, so what happened was inevitable and horrifying. Grave robbers became an industry. They were called resurrectionists, and between 1700 and 1832, they systematically looted cemeteries across Britain. Fresh graves were their target. Bodies decomposed quickly, making them useless for anatomy. So the trade focused on the recently buried. Families would hire night guards to protect graves. Corpses were buried in iron coffins or locked vaults. And still, the grave robbers found ways in. It was organized, it was profitable, and it was a public scandal. The most infamous case was Burke and Hare in Edinburgh in 1828. Two men who realized that murdering people and selling their bodies to anatomists was more efficient than robbing graves. They killed at least 17 people. But when they were finally caught, what shocked the city wasn't just the murders. It was the revelation that anatomists had been knowingly or willfully ignorant about where their bodies were coming from. The trade had become so normal that the supply chain never got examined too closely. And when it did, everyone involved, the doctors, the resurrectionists, the medical institutions, looked complicit. Now here's what this means for Frankenstein. Victor doesn't invent the idea of grave robbing. He grows up in a world where it's happening constantly. When he decides to construct the monster, his immediate thought is to raid graves and charnel houses, because that was the logical source material. Everyone knew this. Shelley knew this. And when you read the novel with this knowledge, Victor's decision stops looking like mad fantasy and starts looking like he's just accessing the underground trade that's happening in his own city. The horror isn't that he's doing something impossible. The horror is that he's doing something that's already happening, just more efficiently. And that's the second revelation. The dissection wasn't science fiction. The anatomical crime was real, industrial, and embedded in how medicine worked. Shelley wrote about it not to invent horror, but to expose the horror that was already normalized. Now I want to shift to something darker still, because Shelley's inspiration came from a very specific moment in history. In 1816, something astronomical happened. A volcano in Indonesia called Mount Tambora erupted, and it was the largest volcanic eruption in recorded history. The ash circled the globe. Temperatures dropped. The world experienced what scientists now call the year without a summer. In 1816, across Europe and America, the summer never came. Snow fell in June. Crops failed. Food became scarce. There was widespread famine, disease, and social panic. In Britain, wheat prices skyrocketed. Rural riots erupted as starving people stormed granaries. The streets of London filled with unemployed workers and refugees. Apocalyptic predictions circled. Some people genuinely believed the world was ending. Shelley was 18 years old, and she was in Switzerland when the worst of it hit. Her life wasn't just shaped by the crisis, it was literally upended by it. She'd recently run away from her father's house with the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, whom she'd married in secret. They were young, broke, homeless, in the middle of a genuine climate catastrophe. They ended up in Geneva, where the weather was so cold and dark that the entire social season was cancelled. No balls, no parties, no society, just families trapped indoors in endless gloom. And here's where the story gets intimate. While Shelley was sitting in that grey, cold world, dealing with genuine scarcity and uncertainty, she lost a baby. Her first child, born prematurely, died in March 1815, just before the Mount Tambora eruption. She was devastated. She was also experiencing the physical aftermath of childbirth, which in early 1800s, medicine could mean infection, fever, and risk of death for weeks afterward. So when she's asked to write a ghost story during that dark summer in Geneva, trapped indoors with Frankenstein's author Byron and other romantic poets, she's not writing from imagination. She's writing from lived experience of loss, of her body failing her, of a world that feels like it might be ending anyway. The result is a novel soaked in grief, cold, isolation, and the terror of creation gone wrong. The Year Without a Summer isn't just atmospheric backdrop, it's the emotional climate of the entire book. The Arctic landscapes, the cold, the darkness, the sense of relentless winter that Victor can't escape. That's not romantic metaphor. That's Shelley encoding her actual lived trauma from one of the most brutal environmental crises of the 19th century. But there's one more layer, and this is where the novel becomes almost uncomfortably personal. I want to talk about what it meant to be an illegitimate child in Regency England, and I want to talk about what that has to do with the creature. Mary Godwin, before she became Mary Shelley, was born to parents who weren't married. Her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, was a famous feminist philosopher. Her father, William Godwin, was a radical intellectual. They married after Mary was born, and Mary Wollstonecraft died from complications of childbirth 10 days later. So Mary grew up as the daughter of a brilliant woman she never knew, raised by a father who was brilliant but increasingly distant, and she carried the weight of being born to unmarried parents in a society that was obsessed with legitimacy. In Regency England, a child born outside marriage was a bastard. The word wasn't metaphorical, it was a legal status. Illegitimate children had no rights to their father's property, no claim on his inheritance, no legal protection if he abandoned them. They were, in the eyes of the law, unmoored from the social structure that organized everyone else's life. They had no place. But there's more. The social stigma was devastating. A single mother was ruined, her reputation destroyed, and women who bore illegitimate children were often abandoned by the men who fathered them. If you were an illegitimate child, you carried the evidence of your mother's sexual transgression on your body. Everyone knew, and you were punished for it. Mary's mother, Wollstonecraft, had written about women's rights, about sexual autonomy, about the unjust structures that trapped women. And then she got pregnant outside marriage, and those structures didn't care about her philosophy. They destroyed her reputation anyway. She died, and Mary inherited both her mother's brilliance and her shame. Now look at the creature in Frankenstein. He's created outside the normal order of things. He has no mother, or rather, he has Victor as a kind of father, but Victor immediately abandons him the moment he sees him. The creature is born into the world with no legal status, no social place, no claim on the man who created him. He's illegitimate. He's a bastard, literally without a family structure to contain him. And what happens? He's beautiful at first, innocent, intelligent, yearning to belong. But everywhere he goes, he's rejected into human society, and people attack him on sight. He learns language, reads Milton's Paradise Lost, understands his own situation in the world. And he comes to understand that he has been cast out, not because of anything he did, but because of how he was born. His very existence is a transgression. When the creature finally speaks to Victor, what does he say? I am malicious because I am miserable. He's not inherently evil. He's made evil by his social situation. He's created a monster, not through his own actions, but through the structure of the world that won't allow him to exist legitimately. This is a novel written by a woman who understood illegitimacy, not as metaphor, but as lived status. Mary knew what it meant to carry the shame of her mother's transgression. She knew what it meant to be outside the legal and social order. She knew what it meant to be blamed for your own creation. And she encoded all of that into the creature. The creature is not just a monster. He's a commentary on a legal and social system that creates monsters by refusing to allow certain people to exist legitimately. And Shelley knew that from the inside. But here's the final layer, and this is the most intimate. I need to talk about what Frankenstein is really about beneath everything else: the terror of pregnancy, childbirth, and maternal death. Mary's mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, died from childbirth complications. It wasn't an anomaly. In the early 1800s, childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for women of reproductive age. The actual risk was somewhere around 1 in 100 births resulting in maternal death, and countless more resulting in serious injury or infection. For women having multiple children over decades, the cumulative risk was enormous. Many women lived in genuine terror of pregnancy. The medical knowledge of the time was limited. Doctors understood that fever after birth was dangerous, but they didn't understand germ theory or infection. They didn't wash their hands between patients. They didn't understand that puerperal fever, also called childbed fever, was being spread by unsanitary conditions. Women died from infections that killed them slowly and agonizingly over days or weeks. And the physical reality of birth without modern medicine was brutal. There was no epidural, no antibiotics, no blood transfusions, no cesarean section available as a safe alternative. Labor could last for days. Tearing was common and severe. Placental complications could cause hemorrhage. And afterward, you were confined to bed for weeks in a weakened state, vulnerable to infection, while your body healed from trauma. In 1816, before she turned 18, Mary Shelley became pregnant and gave birth to a premature daughter who died. The experience nearly killed her. She had a fever, which might have been infection. She was terrified. And she survived, but barely. Now read Frankenstein with this knowledge. Victor describes creating the creature as an almost sexual act. He's obsessed, working night and day, his mind consumed. And then, when the creature comes to life, Victor's first reaction is horror and disgust. He abandons the creature immediately. He can't bear to look at what he's created. He runs away, and his body responds with fever, illness, and psychological collapse. He's haunted by what's coming for him because of what he's made. That is the birth. That is what Shelley is describing. And it's traumatic because Shelley knew what birth trauma felt like. She knew the terror, the physical damage, the sense that something monstrous had come from your own body. She knew the social shame of an illegitimate birth. She knew the fear of being abandoned. She knew the guilt of the child not surviving. And Victor's punishment for creating the creature is to watch his loved ones die. His bride is killed on their wedding night, a direct parallel to death in childbirth. His best friend is killed. His father dies of grief. Everyone he tries to love is destroyed. And the source of all that destruction is the creature, the thing that came from his body, his obsession, his act of creation. Frankenstein is a horror novel about reproduction itself. It's about the terror of bringing something into the world. It's about the loss of control once that thing is created. It's about the physical and psychological toll on the person doing the creating. And it's written by a woman who had experienced all of those things: the loss of a child, the terror of childbirth, the social shame of illegitimate creation, the feeling of being unmothered and unmoored in a world that didn't want her to exist. Every major revelation in the novel, the dead creature coming to life, the abandonment, the isolation, the murders of loved ones, is Shelley saying, in the only way she could say it, what reproduction felt like for her, what it felt like to create something and lose it, what it felt like to be created by parents whose love couldn't protect her, what it felt like to exist in a world that treated her very existence as shameful. The monster isn't Victor's creature. The monster is everything that 19th century England couldn't control. The real science of Galvanism, the illegal trade in corpses, the illegitimate child with no place in society, the woman who survived childbirth trauma and wouldn't stop writing about it. Mary Shelley wrote a novel that looks like pure Gothic fantasy, but it's actually a forensic document. Every page is evidence of the world she lived in. The Galvanism experiments were happening. The resurrection men were robbing graves. The year without summer was darkening the sky. Illegitimate children had no legal status, and women were dying in childbirth, their bodies broken by pregnancy, and their deaths erased by society's indifference. Frankenstein is a masterpiece not because of its imagination, but because of how precisely it translates lived horror into a form that makes the reader feel what Shelley felt. Once you see that, the novel stops being about mad scientists and starts being about the actual conditions of human reproduction, scientific ethics, and the way society creates the monsters it then fears.